chose his words quite carefully. He said, I want to retain the radicalism of Jeremy. And the great thing about that is it can mean whatever it likes to the person hearing that statement. I think if you're committed to nationalisation, that is quite radical, because I'm 40 as much of a lifetime. You got used to, sadly, the progressive march of privatisation. So I think nationalisation is radical, but clearly his definition of radicalism, and he's getting advice from one or two former New Labour cabinet ministers, their definition of radicalism is completely different to that of momentum. So you can understand why there's friction, but that has to be there.
It's always fascinating to listen to what words politicians choose to pick and what they mean to different people. Peter Edwards, we really appreciate your perspective. Thank you for joining us. And just lastly, in this conversation, let's turn back to our panel. Henry and Claire, a last word on this week. We're expecting nothing big happening for the rest of today and tomorrow, but a last word on this week, Henry.
I think it's very exciting for people like us who cover politics, you know, the day-to-day cut and thrust of it, but the fundamentals remain unchanged. Boris Johnson's poll rating is well underwater. His ability to connect with voters is the only reason Tory MPs made him Prime Minister. And if he doesn't salvage it, and I don't think he will, his premiership is in its last legs.
And Claire, can he salvage it?
I don't think he can. I think this has now fatally wounded him, but I think we need to play down the sort of overexcitement of a group of MPs who haven't quite got the timings right just yet. Well,
it's going to be a fascinating next week. So much more to come. Thank you so much for joining us for this really interesting discussion after a momentous 48 hours in British politics. Well, coming up, Plan B has been scrapped. Are we finally entering a world where we learn to live with COVID? Stats guru Jamie Jenkins will discuss this with me next. But before that, let's take a little look at the weather.
Hello. It is a sparkling day of winter sunshine out there for the vast majority. It's a little fresh perhaps, but certainly tonight it's going to turn cold with a hard frost forming pretty quickly. Here's the reason why the weather's so settled at the moment. A chunky area of high pressure. But the winds go around the high like that, so they are coming down the North Sea. So it's the east coast that's seeing a fairly brisk and chilly wind, and there are a few showers. Coastal strip of Lincolnshire down into Norfolk in particular, seeing a few showers and a brisk wind. It's quite breezy across the Northern Isles. Any showers here fading away. Some patchy cloud, but for the vast majority it is blue skies and temperatures getting up to 5 to 7 degrees Celsius, touch below average. Certainly feeling cold with that breeze on the east coast, but in the sunshine, as I said. It's a cracking day generally. Quite quickly this evening, though, notice how the blue hue takes hold of the map. A frost forming very quickly this evening. It's going to be a very cold night. Later in the night, cloud will spill into Northern Ireland, Western Scotland and northwest England, which will help to lift the temperatures here. But certainly across much of the south and the east, a frost and a really cold night across the south, one of the coldest of the winter so far. So a hard frost in the south on Friday morning, but then plenty of sunshine here to come on Friday. Another sunny day across the east with lighter winds. Probably feeling a bit warmer from Yorkshire down to East Anglia. But it will be cloudier further west, and I think we'll keep a lot of cloud through the day for Wales, northwest England, Northern Ireland, Western Scotland. The odd spot of drizzle over the Highlands, but for the vast majority it's dry. Temperatures maybe a touch higher, but it won't feel as warm with the cloudier skies in the west. It will probably feel a bit milder tomorrow in the east without those winds. The wind's picking up further in the northwest with a bit more patchy rain as we head through Friday night. There are weather fronts which will push in here this weekend, bringing some patchy rain to western Scotland. But for most places, it's dry this weekend with a mixture of cloudy spells and a bit of sunshine.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're watching and indeed listening to The Briefing on GB News. Now, face masks will no longer be required from next week, and work from home advice is ending immediately after the Prime Minister announced the end of Plan B rules in England. The legal duty to self-isolate with COVID-19 will also lapse from the 24th of March at the latest, with Number 10 saying, if possible, this date could be brought forward. Now, the Prime Minister added that isolation requirements will go, quote, just as we don't place legal obligations on people to isolate if they have the flu. Well, the bonfire of COVID rules came after ONS data showed that COVID-19 cases were falling in most parts of England, and after government scientists judged the Omicron variant had now peaked nationwide. I have to say that cases did tick up a little bit over the last couple of days, but still well below that peak. Well, let's discuss all of the data and all of the policy now with the former head of health statistics at the ONS, Jamie Jenkins. Welcome to the programme, Jamie. In your view, is this the right time frame? Plan B, over and done with, and as we emerge from the winter, getting rid of those last remaining restrictions as well?
Yeah, afternoon, Tom. I think so. Obviously, remember last July we said we were going to have to learn to live with COVID, and then we got into the winter months and we started seeing that big spike. But the large number of cases that we've seen over the winter has been driven obviously by the Omicron variant. Now, the Omicron variant itself has kind of been the game changer in the pandemic, because whilst we now know, and we were getting some early evidence of this out of South Africa, that it's a far more transmissible variant, it clearly is less deadly, because if you look at the number of patients in hospital, we get statistics every week. Half the patients in England's hospitals are in with COVID, but not because of it. And that's significantly up on what we had with the Delta variant, where COVID was predominantly the main reason why patients were going in. And we're seeing the same thing now with people on ventilators. That never really rose at all during the winter months. It crept up a little bit, but very marginally, not compared to anywhere near what we saw with the cases. And they're coming down at the lowest point since July as well. So I think the question really in terms of living with COVID and what the Prime Minister is talking about, that we don't self-isolate with the flu, is that you remember now before COVID, we always had pressures on the NHS. So I think the question really needs to move on, not about learning to live with COVID. It's what can the health system what does the health system need to deliver in a normal winter, so that next winter, regardless of any variant or COVID or flu, that the NHS won't be kind of saying and panicking that we need to put some restrictions in to stop the NHS getting overwhelmed. I think that's the critical thing for the next 7 or 8 months as we go into next winter.
And I suppose there's a difference here in between what the definition of being overwhelmed means. Clearly, there were lots of healthcare professionals who had a pretty tough time and have been having a pretty tough time over the last few months. Omicron did produce a few thousand more hospitalisations than we would have liked, but it didn't collapse the NHS. And is that an important distinction?
No, I think so. Actually, if you look at the number of patients in critical care, so let's put COVID to one side a sec. If you actually look at the number of patients in COVID over this winter, it's actually been lower than what we had pre-COVID. Now, we did have a massive spike last year, when we is what it was formerly known. We had a huge spike last year, huge pressure on the NHS. But this year, we haven't. Now, in part of that might be that, some patients haven't been admitted for elective surgery, which has helped keep kind of the pressure down. But we haven't seen that big spike. So yeah, what is the definition of overwhelming the NHS is going to be a critical thing as we move forward in the debate, because cancer operations are being cancelled pre-COVID during the winter months, ambulance delays were occurring. So I think Boris is right. We can't continue with self-isolation forever. New variants may come, and they may change the game again. But history would say, especially with the flu, when we look at the Spanish flu 100 years ago, these variants kind of learn to become more transmissible but less deadly to survive themselves. So if Omicron continues the way things are, I don't think we should really be looking to self-isolate for something where the vast majority of people don't get seriously ill at all.
It seems as if there's been a sort of change in consensus, really. I was reading a piece by a medical professional in The Guardian just this morning suggesting that now is the time to live with COVID. The Labour Party not outright opposing the government's announcement on this either. Do you sense that there's a greater form of consensus in this country now, that this is the time to complete the pandemic?
Yeah, well, if The Guardian are writing things like that, Tom, there's clearly been a shifting kind of attitude, because they're normally the ones kind of pushing for further restrictions and the like. And the facts don't lie. If you're looking at them, we're seeing the lowest number of patients seriously ill since July. The deaths figures as well now, you've got to treat with very extreme caution the daily figures that we get, because remember, they're deaths within 28 days of a positive test. Now, they're kind of running around between 200 to 300 a day at the moment. But when you actually look at the ONS figures on deaths, where the death certificate says it's specifically because of COVID, it's around 100. Now, obviously, that's 100 tragic deaths, but to put that into kind of context, that's around about 5.86% of all the deaths. The significant people die every single week. And as we move forward now, and the cases are starting to come down, just like they did in South Africa, there are some green shoots out there. We can't continue, obviously, to impose restrictions, because there's the other effect of people's mental health. So I think now is probably the time. Other parts of the devolved nations aren't following suit as quickly. That potentially could be political. But, I think I did say a few weeks ago that by February we should be over the worst of this, and it's looking extremely likely at that as well.
Well, let's hope this was the last winter dominated by COVID. Jamie Jenkins, thank you very much for joining us, former head of health stats at the ONS. Of course, thanks for joining us on the briefing. Well, coming up next, the French President Emmanuel Macron says the EU needs to be tough on the UK over Brexit. We'll analyse what he's had to say, but first, here's the latest headlines with Rosie.
Thanks, Tom. It is 2:33. I'm Rosie White here in the GB News newsroom to get you up to date. A senior Conservative MP has accused the government of intimidating MPs who tried to remove Boris Johnson. Chair of the Public Administration Committee, William Ragg, one of those calling for the Prime Minister to resign, says rebels have faced pressures and intimidation from ministers. He's urged MPs to report threats of blackmail to the police. Boris Johnson, though, is adamant there's no evidence to support the allegations. The Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, who's in Bury, says she will not call for a by-election in Bury South. It comes after the MP, Christian Wakeford, defected from the Conservatives to the opposition. He says Labour will give the country the leadership it deserves, not one they are embarrassed by. Ghislaine Maxwell's legal team have filed a motion for a retrial weeks after she was found guilty of grooming underage girls to then be sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein. Maxwell's lawyer says a juror disclosing he was sexually abused as a child could have convinced other members of the jury to convict her. The British socialite is due to be sentenced in June. The number of students choosing to study nursing has surged since the start of the pandemic. UCAS reveals a record 28,800 students in England selected a nursing course as their first choice last year when applying to university. Nearly 7 in 10 18-year-olds say COVID inspired them to apply. Emma Raducanu and Andy Murray have been knocked out of the second round of the Australian Open, both beaten in their second round matches. US Open champion Raducanu was hampered by blisters on her racket hand, while the three-time Grand Slam champion Andy Murray said he was disappointed and frustrated to go out so early. You are up to date here on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. Now, after a short break, we'll be back to the briefing with Tom.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Well, over a drink, we have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're watching and listening to The Briefing here on GB News. It's 2:38, just gone. Now, Emmanuel Macron has called on the European Union to be tough with the UK and force it to stick to commitments laid out on the Northern Ireland Protocol and fishing. In a speech to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, the French president also said that the EU must commit to strategic rearmament in the face of threats, notably from Russia, with whom he called for frank and demanding talks. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by former Brexit Party MEP Ben Habib. And let's start off on these comments over Brexit from the French president. How much are these going to be continued over the next year, or how much of this is sort of tub thumping to be expected in the run-up to those French presidential elections in just a few months' time?
There's no doubt, Tom, that an element of it is tub thumping, but the reality of the position is that the United Kingdom has signed a withdrawal agreement, which includes the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it has signed a trade and cooperation agreement, which includes the fishing rights that we've given away to France and the European Union at large. So, in a sense, as much as I'm reluctant to say it, Macron has a point. We have signed these agreements, and whilst the protocol is an affront to, the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom, it's put us in a very weak negotiating position. And to add to our woes, even though we acknowledge that we have the right to invoke Article 16, this sort of famous article to suspend parts of the protocol if they cause economic, environmental, societal damage to Northern Ireland, even though we acknowledge that, the British government hasn't actually used that one legitimate tool it has at its disposal to take the protocol to task. So, in the absence of the British government developing political will and using the protocol, at least to the extent that it's able to protect our own position, I'm afraid Macron has a point, and we're in a slightly weak position.
Would you not say, though, that the government is, to some extent, using a threat of the provisions contained within the protocol to change that protocol, that it was almost written to be changed? And as we know, negotiations are going on at the moment between Maros Sefcovic and Liz Truss. We may well see some pretty substantial amendments to that protocol, potentially, though, after the French elections.
Yeah, well, I think the problem we've got is that we've called wolf far too often. we've been threatening since the G7 last June that we wouldn't hesitate to invoke Article 16. And actually all we've done is hesitate. And even Lord Frost said that if he didn't have an agreement over Northern Ireland by the end of November, we would invoke Article 16. The DUP, Jeffrey Donaldson, famously said that he'd bring down Stormont if we didn't have an agreement by the end of November. But on all fronts, we've capitulated. So the European Union doesn't actually believe we have the courage to take these steps. And I just remind viewers, Tom, that actually Article 16 isn't a nuclear button or a draconian step. It requires both parties to sit down and negotiate for a period of a month after it's been invoked. So really all it does is set a proper clock ticking on an agreement taking place. And I mean, Liz Truss has made some fantastic noises. She wrote a superb article in the Sunday Telegraph last week, setting out precisely how she wanted to negotiate with the EU and what was reasonable for the United Kingdom. And I wholeheartedly endorse everything she said. But we've got to see that in action. We can't just hook our, hoist our petard to words, as it were. We've got to actually, run a flag up the pole and be firm. And I'm afraid the first step in convincing the European Union that we're firm it would be in invoking Article 16.
Now, I really wish we had a bit longer on this conversation, but in our final minute, Ben Habib, just what the French president said with regards to Russia, with Russian aggression. Looking at Germany, they've been pretty protoplasmic in the face of Russia. France seems to be talking tougher.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting comment from Macron. Of course, he's famously an independent European Union military. And independent European Union foreign policy. And what he did yesterday effectively was to undermine the United States position quite completely. But he did so at the same time as rather putting Germany in a pickle, because Germany, as we all know, is hugely reliant on Russian gas. So for him to start talking tough independently of the US with Russia doesn't just put the American foreign policy into difficulty. It actually causes real complications for Germany. And it's interesting, isn't it? It reveals one of the problems at the heart of the European Union project, that what's good for one European Union member state isn't always good for another. And we see that playing out with Poland, Hungary. We've seen it play out with Greece and Italy, and now we're seeing it, over the European Union stance with Russia. It's vintage Macron banging the drum and not really thinking through the consequences of what he's saying.
I have to say, I do find it slightly ironic in this conversation that after all of those people alleged that Brexit was some pro-Russian project, it's Britain, after all, that seems to be standing firmest against Russia, and Germany that seems to be capitulating a little bit. I'm afraid we've run out to the end of that conversation, but Ben Habib, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. Really interesting to keep an eye on what's going on overseas, even as our Parliament seems to be obsessing with itself. Well, let's talk a little bit more now about what's going on in that Parliament. We mentioned Liz Truss in that conversation, and of course she's not only Foreign Secretary, not only Women and Equalities Minister, not only in charge of renegotiating the protocol, but also a bit of a leadership contender. Claire, where do you see where the field of play is in terms of the candidates to potentially replace Boris?
There are a lot of meetings taking place. There's a lot of sounding out of colleagues going on in hushed rooms in Westminster at the moment. And it would appear that there were perhaps 6 contenders waiting to go forward. And I mean, we all know that it won't end up just with 6. You will always have others joining in. But the names are interesting. So you have Liz Truss. You also have Penny Mordaunt. You have Tom Tugendhat and Nadhim Zahawi. That's quite a diverse bunch. They're not the usual names that you would expect. They're not the names that have been around in previous contests. So I think it really is interesting now to watch which teams are forming and who's going to back them. And Henry, we saw Rishi Sunak side by side with Boris Johnson, walking into Prime Minister's questions with him yesterday, sitting right next to him, nodding. That was over everyone's television screens. Is Rishi hugging Boris close to seem more loyal after a bit of a less than loyal start to the week?
Yeah, I think Rishi possibly found himself out on a limb unexpectedly when the rest of the cabinet rallied round Boris Johnson, and ultimately, in a Tory leadership contest, nobody wants to be the one to have plunged the knife into the outgoing Prime Minister. It's always helpful to have somebody else do it. So Tory leadership contenders are currently having to face a really, really tricky balancing act, especially if they're in cabinet. Because on the one hand, they have to publicly extol the virtues of the government and their loyalty to the Prime Minister. At the same time, they have to go and have meetings with donors, talk to MPs, and that inevitably gets back to people like us who then tell the world about it. So it's a very tricky balancing act, and the Chancellor, as the front runner, of course, has the most to lose. So he'll be being very careful indeed.
And Claire, the Chancellor's had apparently drinks with around 100 MPs over the last week. We've been hearing about fizz with Liz as well, drinks with the Foreign Secretary and MPs. Have we heard about any other manoeuvres going on?
Nothing quite as brazen as that. You could argue that the Chancellor would have meetings with MPs anyway to discuss certain funding arrangements in constituency. So that's not quite as suspect as the so-called fizz with Liz. But I think other members will be taking a slightly slower look at this. We have to remember the timing has got to be right in order to do this. At the moment, we have a Prime Minister. There is not a vacancy. So nobody is going to want to come out of the traps first. So they will look quite closely at what the landscape is. And this is why next week will be very interesting with the report of Sue Gray. And then I think we'll start to see some manoeuvres.
And that curse of the sort of that stalking horse, the curse that befell Michael Heseltine at the end of the 1980s, seemed to be the person who wielded the knife, never got the crown. Does that mean that this will sort of stay in a state of suspended animation, Henry?
I think it's one of the reasons that we are waiting, or MPs are waiting, for some kind of catastrophe that will force Boris Johnson to resign, precisely because they don't really want to do it. The other reason, of course, is that this is simply, as I said, a really bad time to have a Tory leadership contest. And the ideal time after the May elections is that you've got the summer. There's no pressure on the NHS. People aren't using their household heating, so the energy crisis is less. It's a good time to have something that's relatively self-indulgent. Whereas if you're the Chancellor, especially, the last thing you want to be doing is spending February and March going up and down the country stumping Conservative associations when Labour can accuse you of neglecting the day job. So I think lots of people want the job. There's a general recognition that Boris Johnson's not going to fight the next election. But for all sorts of reasons, nobody wants to be the one to push him out of the window.
Well, Henry, Claire, thank you so much for your thoughts this afternoon. It's such a febrile time in Westminster, in politics. It's fascinating to follow every twist and turn. No doubt we'll be having an even more exciting conversation next week. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, now let's turn to another issue of the day. I think that famous phrase, "a week is a long time in politics," really does need updating. At the moment, it feels like every hour is a long time in politics. The rollercoaster fortunes of this Prime Minister have felt in entirely different places at any moment. On Monday, he was safe this week. By Tuesday, he looked like a goner. By Wednesday afternoon, he was a whole load safer. And today, his number 10 operation looks under threat, although his personal position might just about survive. The twists and turns of this tale in the space of hours and days will fill many future books. Yet, a consensus appears to be developing around saving grace, one moment that might have turned the tide, a deus ex machina that halted the letters and reunited the Tory party. His name is Christian Wakefield. Yes, Labour's announcement of this defection was a theatrical masterstroke, one that upended the day, but also one that potentially backfired. Nothing united the Parliamentary Conservative Party behind Boris Johnson quite like it. The sudden realisation who the real enemy was, where the real threat lay. This was a crystallising moment in the eyes of some potential rebels. The realisation that they had become a party tearing chunks out of itself over drinks in a garden. As one MP told me yesterday, it seemed as if the Tories took a step back and asked themselves, what are we doing? Potentially, Boris has a lot to thank Mr Wakeford for. One less letter, after all, a greater sense of party unity. And a by-election dodged, of course, as Labour decide to take the cue from the democracy dodgers at Change UK, rather than the real Democrats like Douglas Carswell and Mark Reckless, who both resigned their seats when defecting to win them anew for their new party. It's a sad moment for our politics that the noble tradition initiated by those Cameron-era defectors has been thoroughly put to bed just as it was beginning. A sad moment for our politics, perhaps, but a short-term relief for Boris, as no doubt Bury South would swing deeply red, judging by the current state of the national polls. Not that mid-term by-elections have ever been particularly predictive of general election outcomes, especially general election outcomes that are the best part of 3 years away. Why is it that Labour is avoiding this free hit? Potentially long-term thinking, re-establishing the tradition of calling a by-election upon defection as a rule would potentially put off any further defectors. Not that many further defectors seem all that likely. I have to say that last night I spoke to a number of Tory MPs, some of whom were genuinely shaken by the loss of their colleague. Some close to Wakeford spent Monday evening drinking with him in what we now know was the same day, mere hours after Wakeford secretly met with Keir Starmer. It was the best-kept secret in Westminster, and since its explosive revelation, it has shocked, saddened, and strengthened the resolve of those Tories who had seen themselves as close to their former party colleague. If we've seen that rollercoaster of fortunes and emotions in just over 1 day, heaven knows what next week has in store. Well, let's talk about what is coming up next. I'm joined now by GB News political editor Darren McCaffrey. Darren.
So can I have a little conversation, if we can, about why this story matters?
Yes.
Because I think we've been talking a lot, and there's lots of different presenters on this channel who've got different views about why this story matters, and there's lots of the audience out there who, frankly, have said repeatedly, and understandably so, why do we keep banging on about these parties?
Why not talk about Russia? Why not talk about China?
The cost of living crisis. Yeah. There's a load of things. In fact, actually, I just saw today on the way in 100,000 school kids have fallen off the school register during the pandemic. Where have these kids gone to? There are lots of big issues, of course there are. I think in large parts the reason it does matter, not least of all because the Prime Minister's job is genuinely on the line. We're not making that up. I mean, there clearly is quite a lot of frustration amongst the Conservative Party, even if it's not necessarily expressed in public all the time. But I think it's fundamental, and it buys into the arguments that you would hear Dan Wootton make, or Patrick Christie's, or Mark Dolan on this very channel, which was that the government, for the last 18 months, nearly 2 years now, has asked an awful lot of people, having curbed people's freedoms to a degree that we've never really seen in this country before, not even during actual wars. And that then comes with an element of responsibility. If you're going to ask people to do that, there's an element of responsibility that you also have to be seen to adhere to the rules. It comes back to a very fundamental, basic principle in democracy, that no one is effectively above the law, not even our leaders. And that's why I think the story is really important, because it boils down to the essence of what politics is all about, particularly in democracy, about trust. And if we don't trust our leaders, well, then what's the point of it altogether? And I think that's the reason that while some people say it's not that important, I don't know why I focus on it, it's not about wine and cheese. It's not about, the parties in themselves, as egregious as that might be to some. It's more fundamentally about whether people were breaking rules, potentially laws, while also setting those rules and laws.
It's fascinating to read what Janan Ganesh wrote in the FT earlier this week. He's been speaking to Americans who are baffled, befuddled why a drinks party could be the downfall of this Prime Minister, until he had to explain to them just how almost bizarrely, peculiarly, pettifoggingly strict our lockdown was, especially that long first lockdown. Well, that's very alien as a concept to many Americans.
No, indeed. And also I would add to that by actually quoting back what Boris Johnson said at COP when he was talking about how Britain is not a very corrupt country. And one of the reasons, actually, and he was entirely right in saying that, one of the reasons we do not have high levels of corruption in this country is because we've got relatively high standards of which we hold our politicians to. And we've got, whether you like it or not, a very vociferous, vigorous press, be that on TV or in the newspapers, who hold our leaders to account, even sometimes on what seem like relatively trivial issues, unlike other politicians in other countries. And that means that sometimes these trivial issues, or what might be perceived as trivial, actually feed into a wider narrative where there are low levels of corruption.
And of course, who is Prime Minister matters about energy. It is the same story as energy costs. It's the same story as inflation. It's the same story as foreign policy. Who is sitting in number 10 really does affect all of those issues.
Yeah, and it is wider reflective. We can date actually lots of this back to beyond so-called Partygate, to Owen Paterson and how that was handled, but also to that big rebellion that we saw in the Commons Do you remember around the introduction of Plan B, certain aspects of that? You know, there's been an element of the Conservative Party, which we've kind of increasingly reflected in our coverage, who've not necessarily been terribly happy with the direction Boris Johnson's been taking the party, not least of all, for example, on tax rises, which we're expecting to come to see in April.
Well, Darren, I know you're going to be exploring all of these issues and more on your programme starting in just 5 minutes' time. I'm afraid that's it for this briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Of course, the show is back every weekday from 9:30 a.m, 12 midday and 3 p.m. And up next, Darren is here with more of that latest from Westminster. But for now, I'll leave you with the weather forecast.
Hello. It is a sparkling day of winter sunshine out there for the vast majority. It's a little fresh perhaps, but certainly tonight it's going to turn cold with a hard frost forming pretty quickly. Here's the reason why the weather's so settled at the moment. A chunky area of high pressure. But the winds go around the high like that, so they are coming down the North Sea. So it's the east coast that's seeing a fairly brisk and chilly wind, and there are a few showers. Coastal strip of Lincolnshire down into Norfolk in particular, seeing a few showers and a brisk wind. It's quite breezy across the Northern Isles. Any showers here fading away. Some patchy cloud, but for the vast majority it is blue skies and temperatures getting up to 5 to 7 degrees Celsius, touch below average. Certainly feeling cold with that breeze on the east coast, but in the sunshine, as I said. It's a cracking day generally. Quite quickly this evening, though, notice how the blue hue takes hold of the map. A frost forming very quickly this evening. It's going to be a very cold night. Later in the night, cloud will spill into Northern Ireland, Western Scotland and northwest England, which will help to lift the temperatures here. But certainly across much of the south and the east, a frost and a really cold night across the south, one of the coldest of the winter so far. So a hard frost in the south on Friday morning, but then plenty of sunshine here to come on Friday. Another sunny day across the east, and with lighter winds, probably feeling a bit warmer from Yorkshire down to East Anglia. But it will be cloudier further west, and I think we'll keep a lot of cloud through the day for Wales, northwest England, Northern Ireland, Western Scotland. The odd spot of drizzle over the Highlands, but for the vast majority it's dry. Temperatures maybe a touch higher, but it won't feel as warm with the cloudier skies in the west. We'll probably feel a bit milder tomorrow in the east without those winds. The wind's picking up further in the northwest with a bit more patchy rain as we head through Friday night. There are weather fronts which will push in here this weekend, bringing some patchy rain to western Scotland. But for most places, it's dry this weekend with a mixture of cloudy spells and a bit of sunshine.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that,